Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle never expected to find his name whispered in the same breath as unprecedented papal appointments. Yet here he walked through the Vatican's ancient corridors at dawn, summoned by Pope Leo XIV himself for reasons no one would explain. The marble floors echoed softly beneath his worn black shoes as he made his way past, Renaissance frescoes that had witnessed centuries of church history. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. For months now, Tegel had grown comfortable with his quiet existence on the periphery of Vatican life, celebrating private masses, tending to correspondence, visiting the forgotten corners of Rome where tourists never ventured. His recent years had been marked by a peculiar kind of peace. After the disappointment of the 2025 conclave, when his name had stirred such hope only to fade when the white smoke rose for another, Tegel had discovered something unexpected in the margins: freedom. Freedom from the weight of expectations. From the burden of being anyone's favorite for anything, he had learned to find God not in the grand halls of power, but in the simple act of showing up where no one else would. This morning felt different, though. The Swiss guard who had delivered the papal summons spoke with unusual urgency, his eyes carrying a gravity that suggested this was no routine audience. "His Holiness requests your immediate presence," the young guard had said, shifting uncomfortably. He emphasized that this could not wait. As Tagle approached the papal apartments, his mind drifted to yesterday's visit with an elderly priest dying alone in a Roman hospital. The man had grasped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Something is stirring in the church. Eminence, I can feel it in my bones." At the time, Tagle had attributed the words to medication or wishful thinking. Now, standing before the heavy wooden door that separated him from Pope Leo XIV, he wondered if the dying priest had sensed something others had missed. The Pope had been notably silent about church affairs lately, governing through prayer more than pronouncement, leading many to wonder what kind of revolution might be brewing in that contemplative mind. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "His Holiness will see you now," came the soft voice from within. Tagle crossed himself, whispered a brief prayer, and reached for the handle. Whatever waited beyond this door would change everything. He could feel it in the unusual stillness of the morning, in the way even the Vatican itself seemed to be holding its breath. Pope Leo XIV rose from his simple wooden desk as Tagle entered, gesturing not toward the formal chairs, but to a small sofa near the window. The papal study was surprisingly modest: books stacked on every surface, a worn crucifix on the wall, and the lingering scent of coffee and old prayer books. "Luis, sit with me," the Pope said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had marked his entire papacy. There was something different in his eyes today, a mixture of excitement and solemnity that made Tagle's chest tighten with anticipation. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who had learned that the most important conversations often began without words. Pope Leo XIV poured coffee from a simple ceramic pot, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I've been watching your work these past months," the Pope began, handing Tagle a cup. "The way you've embraced the margins, the way you found Christ in the forgotten places, it's exactly what the Church needs right now." Tagle nodded, unsure where this was leading. "Holy Father, I've simply tried to serve where I'm needed." "Yes," Leo XIV smiled. "And that's precisely why I'm appointing you Cardinal Prefect for the new evangelization." The words hung in the air like incense. Tagle set down his coffee cup, certain he had misheard. "Holy Father, I don't understand. That position doesn't exist yet." "No." The Pope's eyes sparkled with something between mischief and profound purpose. "It will be created for you. The Church needs someone who understands that evangelization isn't about programs or strategies. It's about presence. It's about going to the peripheries, not with answers, but with ears." Tagle felt the room spinning slightly. "But the curia, the cardinals, they'll want to know what this means." "What authority? Let them wonder." Pope Leo XIV interrupted gently. "Sometimes the Church moves fastest when its bureaucrats are confused." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Luis, I'm not giving you an office. I'm giving you a mission. To rebuild the Church's heart from the margins inward." The weight of it settled on Tagle's shoulders like a mantle he hadn't asked for, but somehow recognized. "Holy Father, I don't know if I'm capable of neither," did Peter when Christ asked him to feed his sheep. The Pope placed a weathered hand on Tagle's shoulder. But you've already begun, haven't you? In the hospitals, the refugee camps, the forgotten parishes. You've been practicing for this your entire life. Tagle closed his eyes, feeling something shift deep within his soul, not ambition, but surrender. The news moved through the Vatican like wildfire through dry grass, sparking conversations in hushed corners and sending officials scrambling for their phones. By noon, every cafe within a mile of St. Peter's buzzed with speculation about Pope Leo XIV's stunning announcement. In the Secretariat of State, Cardinal Bertolli stared at the brief PayPal statement on his computer screen, reading, "It, for the 5th time, Cardinal Prefect for the new evangelization." The words made no sense. There was no such dicastery, no budget allocation, no organizational chart that included this position. He reached for his phone to call the PayPal secretary, then hesitated. Pope Leo XIV had a habit of making decisions that revealed their wisdom. Veteran Vatican correspondent Maria Gonzalez leaned across her tiny table, speaking urgently into her phone. "No, you don't understand. This isn't just an appointment. It's a revolution disguised as paperwork." She stirred her espresso absently, her mind racing. Tegel has been invisible for months, and now suddenly he's given a role that doesn't exist? Leo XIV is playing chess, while the rest of us are playing checkers. Back in the Vatican, young monsignors clustered around water coolers, their voices mixing excitement with bewilderment. "He's the one who speaks 7 languages, whispered one. "Remember the video of him with the refugees?" Another shook his head uncertainly. "But what does it mean? Prefect of what, exactly?" In his sparse office overlooking the Tiber, aging Cardinal Toretti set down his reading glasses with a heavy sigh. For 40 years, he had navigated Vatican politics with careful precision, understanding the delicate balance of power that kept the Church functioning. Now Pope Leo XIV seemed determined to upset that balance with appointments that made no institutional sense, but somehow felt profoundly right. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to Tagle's modest quarters, each hoping to glean some insight into his mysterious new role. He received them all with the same gentle smile and the same maddening response: "I serve where the Holy Father sends me." By evening, the speculation had reached fever pitch. Progressive Catholics across social media celebrated what they saw. As validation of a more pastoral approach to evangelization, traditional voices expressed concern about undefined authority and the dangerous precedent of creating positions without clear boundaries. In a small trattoria near the Vatican, seminary professors debated over wine. "It's either brilliant or catastrophic," said the older man. "Leo XIV is either creating space for genuine renewal or setting up Tagle to fail spectacularly." His colleague nodded thoughtfully. "The question isn't what this appointment means today. The question is what it will mean tomorrow when Tagle actually starts doing whatever it is he's supposed to do." Neither man could know that tomorrow would bring answers none of them expected. The humid Manila air embraced Cardinal Tagle like a mother's arms as he stepped off the plane. But even the familiar warmth couldn't ease the weight of uncertainty. Pressing on his shoulders, news of his mysterious appointment had reached the Philippines ahead of him. And the small crowd of well-wishers at the airport searched his face for answers he didn't yet possess. Cardinal Chito called out Mrs. Santos, an elderly catechist who had known him since his seminary days. "What does it mean, this new position?" Her weathered hands clutched his as if holding on to hope itself. Tagle smiled, the same gentle expression that had comforted thousands, but behind his eyes lay questions. "It means I serve where God calls me, Tita. Beyond that, I'm still learning." The jeepney ride through Manila's chaotic streets felt like a pilgrimage through his own soul. Street vendors waved, children ran alongside the vehicle, and the symphony of car horns mixed with the distant sound of church bells. This was his people, his heartland, where the gospel lived, not in documents, but in the daily struggle for dignity and hope. At his childhood parish in Imus, Father Rodriguez, now bent with age but sharp as ever, waited in the simple rectory. They sat together on plastic chairs, sharing instant coffee and the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. "Rome has changed you," the old priest observed, studying Tagle's face. "But not in the way I expected. How so? You look like a man carrying something precious that he's afraid to break. Father Rodriguez leaned forward. What did Pope Leo XIV really tell you? Tegel set down his cup. Considering, he said, the church needs to be rebuilt from the margins inward. That evangelization isn't about programs, but presence. Ah, the old priest's eyes lit up with understanding. He's made you an official nobody, with unlimited authority to be everybody's shepherd. The words hit Tagle like revelation. That evening, walking through Tandamanila's largest slum, he saw his appointment with new clarity. Here, where families lived in structures barely qualifying as shelter, where children played in streets that doubled as sewers. The church's mission wasn't about theology or hierarchy. It was about showing up, staying close, being Christ in the chaos. A young mother recognized him and brought her sick baby forward. "Bless him, Cardinal," she whispered, as Tagle traced the sign of the cross on the infant's forehead. He felt something shift inside him, not the burden of office, but the fire of purpose. Pope Leo XIV hadn't given him a job. He had given him permission to love the church back to life, one forgotten soul at a time. The phone in his pocket buzzed. A message from Rome. The Vatican is waiting for your plan. Tagle smiled, looking out at the slum where Christ walked barefoot. He already had his plan. The mahogany table in the Secretariat of State gleamed under fluorescent lights as Cardinal Bertoli spread organizational charts across its surface, like battle plans. Around him, department heads and monsignors leaned forward with the intensity of generals studying an enemy they couldn't quite identify. Your Eminence Bertoli addressed Tagle with strained courtesy. We need clarity. Budget allocations, reporting, structures, territorial boundaries. The Cardinal Prefect for the new evangelization. What does this position actually do? Tagle sat quietly at the far end of the table, his hands folded, watching the anxiety ripple through the room. These were good men, faithful servants of the church, but they spoke in the language of institution, while his heart increasingly spoke in the language of margins. Perhaps Tagle said gently, "We're asking the wrong questions." Monsignor Castellani's pen stopped mid-note. Instead of asking what this position does, maybe we should ask who it serves. Tagle's voice carried the same calm authority that had silenced slums and refugee camps. The church has plenty of administrators. What we lack are listeners. The room erupted in controlled bureaucratic frustration. Charts were shuffled, throats cleared, meaningful glances exchanged. Cardinal Bertoli's voice carried the weight of centuries of papal organization. Your Eminence, the church runs on structure. Without clear authority, the church runs on grace, Tagle interrupted softly. Structure serves grace, not the other way around. Later that evening, Pope Leo XIV found Tagle kneeling in the papal chapel, candles flickering against centuries-old stones. The Pope slipped in quietly, genuflecting before the tabernacle, before taking a seat in the pew behind his newly appointed prefect. "They're driving you crazy with their charts," Leo XIV observed, with gentle humor. Tagle didn't turn around. "They want to map the unmappable, Holy Father." "How do you create an organizational chart for presence?" "You don't." The Pope's voice grew serious. "Luis, they think I appointed you to manage something. I appointed you to become something. The church has forgotten how to listen to her own heartbeat. You're going to teach her to hear it again. And, if the Curia resists..." Leo XIV was quiet for a long moment, watching the candle flames dance. "Then they'll learn what Peter learned when Christ washed his feet. That authority in the kingdom flows upward from service, not downward from power." Tagle finally turned, seeing in the Pope's eyes something that hadn't been there during their first meeting. Determination tinged with holy defiance. "Tomorrow," Leo XIV continued, "you'll receive your first official assignment. Not from the Secretariat of State, not from any dicastery, from me, directly, and it will clarify everything." The papal secretary's footsteps echoed in the corridor. Outside, carrying an envelope that would change everything. The mud squelched beneath Cardinal Tagle's feet as he walked through the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, his simple black cassock already stained with dust and hope. Word had spread through the makeshift streets that a cardinal from Rome had come not for photographs or speeches, but to sit on plastic crates and listen to stories that had never reached Vatican corridors. "Your Eminence," whispered Agnes, a South Sudanese mother clutching her infant, We pray the rosary every night in our tent. But sometimes we wonder if God still hears prayers spoken in mud. Tagle knelt beside her in the dirt, his eyes level with hers. "Tell me about your prayers," he said simply. "What do you say to God when the night is darkest?" 3,000 miles away, Bishop Morrison received the photographs with mounting concern. Images of Tagle's visit were spreading through Catholic social media, the cardinal eating beans from tin cups, praying with hands that smelled of desperation, blessing children whose official status remained uncertain in every sense. "This isn't how cardinals conduct pastoral visits," Morrison muttered to his assistant. "Where's the liturgical protocol? The proper venues? This looks like Jesus in the Gospels." His young assistant suggested quietly Morrison's glare could have melted wax, but in parishes across 3 continents, something was stirring. In a Lima slum, Father Garcia watched the videos of Tagle's refugee camp visit and felt something ancient awaken in his chest. The next Sunday, he moved his homily from the pulpit to the church floor. Sitting among his congregation, as he spoke about the God who pitches his tent among the displaced dot in Montreal, Sister Catherine saw the images and remembered why she had entered religious life 30 years ago. She began visiting homeless encampments, not with programs or pamphlets, but with presence and prayer. "I'm following Cardinal Tagle's example," she told her superior, who struggled to find fault with evangelization that bore such obvious fruit. In Rome, reports trickled into various Vatican offices, like gentle rain that would soon become a flood. Bishops complained about irregular pastoral methods. Young priests requested transfers to parishes in forgotten neighborhoods. Lay Catholics began organizing listening sessions in their homes, asking not what the Church could do for the marginalized, but what the marginalized could teach the Church. Pope Leo XIV read each report with growing satisfaction. In his evening prayers, he whispered gratitude for appointing a man who understood that the Church's true authority came not from commanding from above, but from kneeling below. The phone on Cardinal Bertoli's desk rang insistently. On the other end, an archbishop's voice carried unmistakable alarm. "We need to discuss Cardinal Tagle's activities. This is getting out of hand." The revolution had begun with dirty knees and open hearts. The consistory hall hummed with tension as red-capped figures took their seats around the ancient chamber. Cardinal Tagle entered quietly, choosing a chair near the back, but every eye tracked his movement. The air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken accusations and barely contained frustration. Pope Leo XIV took his place at the head of the assembly, his expression serene, but his eyes sharp with awareness. He had called this extraordinary meeting of cardinals, knowing full well what storms it would unleash. Cardinal Bertoli rose first, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Holy Father, we must address the irregular activities of the so-called prefect for the new evangelization. Reports from 5 continents describe unauthorized pastoral visits, undefined authority being exercised, and confusion among the faithful. About proper church protocol, murmurs of agreement rippled through the red-clad assembly." Cardinal Morrison leaned forward aggressively. "Your Holiness, with respect, this appears to be evangelization without structure, ministry without boundaries. The faithful need clarity, not confusion." Other voices joined the chorus of concern. What happens when every priest decides he can operate outside diocesan authority? The Church has survived to millennia because of order, not chaos. This sets dangerous precedents. Pope Leo XIV listened in silence, his fingers steepled, before turning to Tagle. "Cardinal Tagle, perhaps you could help our brothers understand your mission." Tagle stood slowly, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of one who had knelt in refugee mud and held dying children. "Your Eminences," he began, "you speak of structure and authority as if they were ends in themselves. But I have seen the Church as Christ sees her wounded, scattered, hungry for a shepherd's voice. In the camps, in the slums, in the forgotten places, people don't ask about my canonical authority. They ask if God still loves them." Cardinal Morrison's face reddened. "That's precisely the problem. Pastoral care without proper oversight is exactly what Christ practiced," Tagle interrupted gently. "He didn't seek permission from the Sanhedrin to heal on the Sabbath." The room erupted. Voices rose in heated Latin and vernacular. Accusations flew about comparing papal authority to ancient Jewish councils. Through it all, Pope Leo XIV remained motionless, watching the battle lines form with the patience of one who had anticipated this moment from the beginning. Cardinal Torretti, the eldest among them, finally stood. His voice, weathered by decades of service, cut through the noise. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the question isn't whether Cardinal Tagle has authority. Perhaps the question is whether the rest of us have forgotten how to use ours." The hall fell silent, but the silence carried more danger than the shouting had. From Dublin to São Paulo, from Los Angeles to Lagos, something unprecedented was happening in the Catholic Church. Videos of Cardinal Tagle's refugee camp visits had gone viral. But more importantly, they had gone deep into the hearts of Catholics who had forgotten that faith could look like kneeling in mud at Sacred Heart Seminary in Chicago. Father Miguel Santos gathered his third-year students around a laptop screen. "Watch how he listens," he told them, as Tagle's image filled the frame. The cardinal sitting cross-legged with Syrian refugees. "See how his presence changes everything without him saying a word." One seminarian raised his hand tentatively. "Father, could we do something like this here?" Within weeks, the seminary had initiated Tagle Tuesdays evenings, when seminarians visited homeless encampments, not to preach, but to listen. Other seminaries requested permission to implement similar programs. The Superior General of the Jesuits received 17 letters in 1 week asking for guidance on Cardinal Tagle's methodology. In Manila, lay Catholics organized what they called margin masses, liturgies celebrated in garbage dumps, under bridges in places where traditional parishes feared to tread. Maria Santos, a catechist inspired by her cardinal's example, brought communion to sex workers in the red light district. "If Cardinal Tagle can sit with refugees," she told her shocked parish priest, "surely Jesus can visit here too." The movement defied institutional boundaries. In Munich, a group of young professionals began meeting weekly in a soup kitchen, combining Eucharistic adoration with service to migrants. Their bishop initially expressed concern, then quietly attended one evening and left in tears. "This is what Vatican II dreamed of," he confided to his secretary. But in Rome, alarm bells were sounding in specific quarters. Cardinal Morrison convened an informal meeting of like-minded prelates in his apartment overlooking the Spanish Steps. Maps covered his dining table, marked with red pins indicating irregular Tagle-inspired activities. "It's spreading faster than we can track," he told the assembled cardinals. Priests abandoning parish boundaries, lay people assuming ministerial roles, religious communities ignoring established protocols. "This isn't renewal, it's chaos." Cardinal Bertoli nodded grimly. "We need a coordinated response. Official guidelines about proper evangelization methods. Clear restrictions on Cardinal Tagle's movements." Across the city, Pope Leo XIV read similar reports with growing satisfaction in his evening prayers. He thanked God for appointing a man who understood that sometimes the Church needed to catch fire before it could give light. The revolution that had begun with dirty knees was now walking on legs of its own. The question was no longer whether it could be stopped, but whether the institutional Church would embrace it or fight it. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning when conservative Catholic blogger Marcus Antonelli published a devastating expose titled "The Cardinal Who Thinks He's Pope." Within hours, the piece had ricocheted across global media like shrapnel from an ecclesiastical bomb. Cardinal Tagle operates without oversight, encouraging priests to abandon their assigned parishes, promoting lay Catholics to assume roles, and systematically undermining 2,000 years of church hierarchy, Antonelli wrote. The post included leaked photographs of Tagle celebrating Mass in unconventional locations and quotes from unnamed Vatican sources expressing grave concern. CNN picked up the story by lunch. Vatican in crisis. Rogue cardinal defies church authority. Fox News countered with, "Is the Catholic Church abandoning tradition?" Within 6 hours, #Tagle controversy was trending worldwide. In the Vatican press office, Director Father Lombardi fielded calls with increasingly strained diplomacy. "Cardinal Tagle operates with full papal approval," he repeated for the dozenth time, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. But when pressed for specifics about Tagle's authority, his answers grew vague, fueling more speculation. The conservative Catholic magazine First Things published an editorial, calling for immediate clarification of Cardinal Tagle's canonical status. The liberal National Catholic reporter defended him as the authentic voice of Vatican II evangelization. Both sides weaponized his silence. Conservatives saw it as admission of wrongdoing. Progressives as dignified restraint. Archbishop Williams of Dublin went on BBC Radio to defend Tagle, only to be contradicted 2 hours later by Cardinal Morrison's spokesman, who suggested certain cardinals may be exceeding their mandate. The mixed messages created a media-feeding frenzy. Through it all, Pope Leo XIV remained conspicuously silent. His daily audiences continued as scheduled, but he offered no public comment on the growing controversy. Vatican insiders reported that he spent longer hours in private prayer, leading to speculation that he was reconsidering Tagle's appointment in his modest Vatican apartment. Tagle knelt before a simple crucifix, surrounded by newspapers bearing his photograph and articles, questioning his motives. Letters poured in, some supportive, others calling for his resignation. The weight of global scrutiny pressed down like a physical force. His phone rang constantly, interview requests, pleas for statements, demands for clarification. He answered none of them. Instead, he opened his breviary and prayed the words that had sustained him through every crisis. "Into your hands I commend my spirit." Outside his window, Rome buzzed with rumors and speculation. Tomorrow's headlines were already being written, and none of them looked kind. The fire that had begun with hope was now burning everything in its path, including its own source. Vatican gardens lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness as Cardinal Tagle walked the ancient paths, his footsteps echoing softly on wet gravel. 3 days of media firestorm had left him hollow, each headline chiseling away at his certainty until only questions remained. The cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, witnesses to centuries of papal anguish, now bearing witness to his own. He found himself at the Grotto of Lourdes, that replica of French stone where so many had sought Mary's intercession. The artificial cave felt like a tomb in the darkness, and Tagle wondered if he was visiting his own burial place, the death of a mission that had burned so brightly only to consume itself. "Did I misunderstand you?" he whispered to the statue. Of the Virgin, barely visible in the shadows, was it pride disguised as service? Ambition masked as humility? The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. For hours, he knelt on the damp stone, his cassock growing cold, his knees aching. The words of accusation swirled through his mind. Unauthorized activities, systematic undermining, rogue cardinal. Each phrase felt like a nail driven deeper as dawn crept across the gardens, painting the sky in shades of doubt and possibility. Tagle's memory drifted to Agnes in the Kakuma refugee camp. Her face materialized before him, weathered by loss, illuminated by hope. "We pray the rosary every night in our tent," she had said, "but sometimes we wonder if God still hears prayers spoken in mud." He remembered the broken rosary in Lourdes, the old woman's tears when he had mended it with simple twine, the seminarian in Chicago who had asked, "Could we do something like this here?" The young mother in Manila who had whispered, "Bless him, Cardinal," as she held her sick child. Were these encounters mistakes? Had he been wrong to kneel in refugee mud, to sit with prostitutes, to celebrate Mass in garbage dumps? The institutional church seemed to think so, but the faces of the forgotten said otherwise. A shaft of morning light broke through the trees, illuminating the grotto. In that moment, Tagle saw with startling clarity that his mission had never been about the approval of cardinals or the comfort of institutions. It had been about Agnes and her tent prayers, about broken rosaries and healing presence. He rose slowly, his knees protesting, his heart strangely calm. The storm would continue, the accusations would multiply, but the faces of the marginalized had spoken louder than all the criticism. Christ had been condemned by religious authorities too, and he had continued walking toward Calvary. The path ahead was clear, even if it led through more darkness. He began walking back toward the Vatican, ready to face whatever came next. St. Peter's Basilica had never seen anything quite like it. Pope Leo XIV had called for a special papal address with only 12 hours' notice. summoning cardinals, bishops, and media from around the world. The Great Dome seemed to hold its breath as thousands packed the pews while millions more watched. Via satellite feeds across 6 continents, Cardinal Tegel sat in the front row, his face serene despite the storm raging around his name. The past week had nearly broken him. But his morning in the gardens had restored something essential: not confidence in himself, but trust in the one who had called him to this impossible mission. Pope Leo XIV approached the papal throne with unhurried dignity, his white cassock flowing like calm water. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the basilica and every corner of the world. "My brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, "the Church stands at a crossroads. We can choose the safety of our familiar structures, or we can choose the dangerous path of the gospel." A murmur rippled through the assembly. This was not the diplomatic language of typical papal addresses. Some have questioned the mission I entrusted to Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. They've asked about authority, about protocol, about proper procedures. The Pope's eyes found Tagle in the crowd. But I asked different questions. Where is Christ calling us? Who have we forgotten? What would happen if we actually followed the gospel? Cardinal Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat as television cameras captured every reaction. Cardinal Tagle has shown us something the Church desperately needs to remember: that evangelization is not about convincing people of our arguments, but about convincing them of God's love through our presence. Leo XIV's voice grew stronger. He has knelt in refugee mud because that is where Christ kneels. He has eaten with outcasts because that is where Christ dines. He has wept with the forgotten because those are the tears Christ sheds. The basilica fell into profound silence. As the Pope continued, "I did not give Cardinal Tagle a position. I gave him permission to love as Christ loves, and if that threatens our institutional comfort, then perhaps our institutions need to be threatened." Around the world, Catholics watched in stunned recognition. Seminary rectors paused their criticism. Conservative bloggers found themselves speechless. Progressive activists wept with vindication. The Church of tomorrow will not be built by those who protect yesterday's boundaries, Leo XIV declared. It will be built by those brave enough to cross into today's margins. As the Pope descended from his throne, spontaneous applause erupted, the polite clapping of diplomatic protocol, but the thunderous ovation of people who had just witnessed revolution dressed as orthodoxy. The Church would never be the same. 6 months after Pope Leo XIV's historic address, the transformation was unmistakable, not in grand proclamations or architectural changes, but in the quiet revolution that had taken root in hearts worldwide. The Church had not merely adapted, it had awakened to something ancient and eternal that had been sleeping beneath layers of institutional comfort. In Chicago, Father Miguel Santos no longer needed to convince seminarians to visit homeless encampments. They requested assignments. There, understanding that theology learned on street corners carried a weight no classroom could provide. The Tagle Tuesdays had become simply Tuesdays, as natural as breathing. One young seminarian, Marcus, had started learning Spanish specifically to communicate with migrant workers who gathered at dawn outside the Home Depot. Cardinal Tagle taught us that evangelization begins with understanding, he told his formation. "Director, how can I serve people whose stories I can't even hear?" The language itself was changing. Parishes across Kenya had begun incorporating Swahili and Somali into their liturgies, not as multicultural gestures, but as recognition that God spoke the languages of the displaced. Young Kenyan priests requested assignments to refugee ministries with the same enthusiasm their predecessors had once sought Vatican postings. Agnes still lived in Kakuma refugee camp, but now she received weekly visits from a steady stream of clergy who came not with answers, but with presence. Her tent prayers had been heard by more than God, they had been heard by a church learning to listen. She had become something of an informal spiritual director, her wisdom sought by bishops and cardinals who recognized that holiness often wore the clothes of displacement. The rosary Cardinal Tagle had helped repair on his first visit had been passed down to her daughter. Its makeshift string, now blessed by more hands than any cathedral relic. In Manila, the changes were equally profound, but characteristically Filipino. In their warmth, the margin masses that had begun as lay initiatives were now officially encouraged by the Archdiocese. Cardinal Tegel's successor, as Archbishop of Menelae, had instituted a monthly Cardinal Tagle Day when all parish activities moved to the streets, literally bringing the church to the people, rather than waiting for the people to come to the church. European dioceses, initially resistant to Tegel's methods, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformations. In Dublin, Archbishop Williams had established listening stations in shopping centers and pubs and formal spaces, where people could share their spiritual struggles without commitment or judgment. The program had reached thousands who had given up on institutional Christianity, but still hungered for transcendence. French parishes, once empty monuments to fading faith, had begun to pulse with new life as clergy adopted Tegel's approach of presence over preaching. Father Dubois in Marseille had moved his office to a café near the harbor, offering spiritual direction between the scent of coffee and the sound of seagulls. People need to encounter Christ in their daily world, he explained to puzzled parishioners, who had expected their priest to remain safely within church walls. Cardinal Tagle walked through the Vatican gardens on a crisp autumn morning, the same paths where he had wrestled with his calling in darkness. The cypress trees seemed different, now not silent sentinels of institutional tradition, but living witnesses to transformation. The Grotto of Lourdes, where he had knelt in his darkest hour, now felt like a place of resurrection rather than burial. His appointment as Cardinal Prefect for the new evangelization was no longer mysterious. Seminary curricula now included ministry at the margins as a core requirement. Dioceses requested training in Tegel methodology, though he cringed at the term, preferring gospel simplicity. What had once seemed dangerously undefined had become beautifully clear. Evangelization through presence, authority through service, leadership through love. Cardinal Morrison, once Tegel's fiercest critic, had undergone his own transformation. A visit to a Tagal-inspired ministry in Bangladesh had shattered his preconceptions about proper pastoral care. He returned to Rome speaking softly about the theology of presence and requesting assignment to parishes in economically depressed areas. "I spent 40 years protecting the church," he confided to his secretary. "Cardinal Tagle taught me to love it instead." The revolution had been silent but thorough, spreading not through decrees but through example, not through force but through attraction. Catholic universities began offering degrees in incarnational ministry. Retreat centers restructured their programs around contemplation in action. Even cloistered communities found ways to participate, opening their monasteries to host reflection sessions for those returning from service in challenging environments. That evening, Tagle found himself where his journey had begun, in a simple chapel, kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament. No cameras captured the moment. No reporters documented his prayers. The red biretta that had once felt like a burden now rested lightly on his head, symbol not of privilege but of responsibility to the least of these. He thought of Agnes and her tent, of the broken rosary now made whole, of seminarians learning Arabic and bishops moving to slums. The church had not been reformed from above, but transformed from below. One encounter at a time, one presence at a time, one act of love at a time. Outside, Rome bustled with its eternal rhythms. Inside, a cardinal who had learned to find God. In refugee mud, offered the same prayer he had whispered since childhood. "Here I am, Lord, send me." The silent revolution was complete, but its fire would burn forever, not in headlines or history books, but in the hearts of those who had learned that the kingdom of heaven belonged to those society had forgotten, and that the church's greatest authority came not from speaking with power, but from listening with love. In chapels and camps, in cathedrals and slums, the church continued its ancient mission with newfound authenticity, carrying light to darkness, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, revolutionary act of showing up where love was needed most.